The topic for this presentation is on adult victims of child abuse. Now, this is a topic that I believe isn't as widely discussed as much within our society compared to just child abuse in children. I think this is because people forget that once a child becomes an adult, that their abuse is still present in their lives. People may just assume that the problem is no longer there because they're all grown up now. That is hardly the case for many adult survivors. The abuse stays with the person well into their adulthood and can have harmful effects. Recovering from the abuse can be a long-term healing process that can take an entire lifetime to achieve, and even then, some aren't able to completely heal. Many do heal from their abuse, but others do not. I believe it is important to me and to everyone else to become a little more educated on this subject. For this presentation, I will be covering the definition of child abuse, the various consequences that come with being abused, the treatments available to adult survivors to recover from their past abuse, and what we can do as individuals and as future professionals to help victims. I feel like some people have an idea of what child abuse looks like, but would have a difficult time defining it. So with that being said, according to the Federal Child Abuse Prevention and Treatment Act, the official definition of child abuse is any recent act or failure to act on the part of a parent or caretaker which results in death, serious physical or emotional harm, sexual abuse, or exploitation, or an act or failure to act which presents an imminent risk of serious harm. These abusive actions can be done to a child in various ways. We classify these actions into different types of abuse. The four major types, however, are physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. For this presentation, we will be focusing on all of them as a whole. According to the National Association of Adult Survivors of Child Abuse, 1 in 4 girls and 1 in 6 boys are likely to be sexually abused before their 18th birthday. That is 20 to 25% of youth who are at risk of being abused. It is found that 50% of children will experience one of the 4 types of abuse at least once in their childhood. Also, a child abuse case is reported every 10 seconds. Finally, it was reported in 2012 that there were 42 million sexual abuse survivors in America. That was 6 years ago. Can you begin to imagine how big that number has grown since 2012? So, what do these numbers mean? It means that we're surrounded by survivors. It means that there may be someone you know or someone you love that may be struggling with child abuse. This means we have the power as future professionals to recognize the signs and help save a person's life. Before I discuss the countless consequences a survivor faces from their abuse, it is important to note that there are many factors that can influence the consequences of the abuse. These factors influence how severe or moderate the consequences will be for an individual. For example, high frequency and long duration of abuse are very common factors that determine how severe a consequence will be for an individual. A child who is abused for 6 years, twice a week, may suffer much worse than someone who was only abused once. This isn't always true, but is a very common pattern found. Other influential factors include the severity of the abuse, the age a child was when they were abused, the type of abuse they received, the relationship with their abuser, and many, many more factors. When working with adult survivors, it is important to learn of their factors to get a better understanding of what they're going through and what they've experienced. It is crucial to understand that everybody experiences and responds to their abuse differently. This means that the consequences may vary from person to person. Some survivors may show very little consequences, while other people may be struggling with numerous consequences. The most common types of consequences, which I will be discussing more in depth, include post-traumatic stress disorder, intergenerational abuse, re-victimization, physical health problems, mental health problems, suicidal ideations, and an array of many more different types of consequences. Note that survivors are not limited to this list of consequences. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, is an incredibly common consequence that child abuse victims, and quite honestly victims of many other different types of abuses, may acquire. In order to be diagnosed with PTSD, a victim must meet certain criteria that is available to mental health professionals in the Diagnostic Statistical Manual, or the DSM-5. To be diagnosed with PTSD, a victim must experience, or much rather have, re-experiencing thoughts or nightmares of their abuse. Also, a person who has PTSD may be presenting a lack of responsiveness, also known as dissociation, or they may be experiencing avoidance in their daily lives. For example, a victim may refuse to leave their home because they're too afraid to go outside. They may avoid talking to men if their abuser was also a male. They may avoid creating friendships because they can no longer trust individuals. Finally, a victim must have symptoms that include increased arousal, like jumpiness, and experience sleep problems or poor concentration. In order for a diagnosis to be considered, it must in some way affect a victim's life. It could affect their life socially, emotionally, or occupationally. Another common and very sad consequence for survivors is intergenerational abuse. Usually, as children, we pick up certain behaviors, patterns, and habits from our parents, relatives, and other influential people. It is nature to do so while growing up. In some ways, this could be good, but sadly, some adult survivors will pick up the habit of abuse from their abuser and pass this on to their own children. This is known as intergenerational abuse. Some survivors may not be aware of the consequence of their abuse because this was the type of treatment that they received as a child. They may see this just as a necessary and normal part of growing up. This can create a never-ending cycle of child abuse that spreads from generation to generation. If not addressed, it has the potential to ruin childhoods for generations to come, which can have harmful effects on a child's future relationships, marriages, and families. Re-victimization is one terrifying consequence that can occur for child abuse survivors. People who were victims of abuse in their childhood are at a higher risk for being re-victimized as an adult compared to people who weren't abused as children. Sadly, this is especially true for women. An Australian survey known as the International Violence Against Women Survey, IVWAS for short, found that 72% of child abuse survivors who were women were abused later in their adult life. This was an incredible difference compared to the 43% women who weren't abused as children and were abused later in adulthood. Though unclear why, it is important that both men and women build efficient coping skills and plans of actions so they are prepared if they are ever put into a dangerous and abusive situation. They will be knowledgeable on how they should act or how they should defend themselves. It is common for victims of child abuse to suffer from multiple physical problems. Actually, they are more likely to have more physical issues than the general population. The list is not limited to these issues, but some common types of health problems include diabetes, gastrointestinal problems, arthritis, headaches, gynecological problems, stroke, hepatitis, and heart disease. There is some speculation that the reasons why survivors are prone to more physical health problems may be due to their behaviors and actions after their abuse. For example, a survivor who may be coping with their abuse may choose to drink heavily to ease the pain. This makes them more likely to suffer from liver problems later on in life. Also, a survivor who doesn't care about their life anymore may stop taking care of themselves and washing themselves, which can lead to gynecological issues. Other survivors might let themselves go and overeat to the point where they acquire diabetes, heart disease, or obesity. Another extremely common consequence of the result of child abuse is suffering from mental health problems. The most common disorders are post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. A longitudinal study found that adults who were abused as children were 2.5 times more likely to acquire major depressive disorder and 6 times more likely to acquire PTSD than the general population. However, other types of disorders that people are at risk of developing are personality disorders, psychosis, and dissociative disorder. Dissociative disorder, formerly known as multiple personality disorder, is a very common disorder, especially for children to acquire when being severely abused. This is because the mind has a way of sensing the trauma, and in order to cope with the trauma, the mind will split the brain into multiple parts, or personalities, so that only parts of the person can remember the trauma, but the host, that individual, will not. The brain automatically splits the mind in order to protect themselves. Though this may be helpful while they're experiencing the trauma, the multiple personalities remain, which can be very difficult for victims to control in life. There is also correlation between child abuse and suicide attempts. This is especially true for young adults. An adverse childhood experiences study found that child abuse victims who suffered from more than 4 abusive experiences were 12 times more likely to attempt suicide. Not every survivor may consider suicide, but some of the main causes of suicidal ideation may be due to an underlying mental disorder they're suffering from, such as major depressive disorder. Because this topic is incredibly important and should be taken incredibly seriously, if you know someone or are someone who may be considering suicide, don't be afraid to call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline for help and support. Other tragic common consequences for adult survivors are eating disorders, alcohol and substance abuse, aggression, violence, criminal behavior, risky sexual behavior, and even homelessness. Homelessness is a common consequence because, as mentioned previously, people may stop taking care of themselves. They may give up on life and refuse to pay bills and may end up losing their home. Many adult survivors may struggle keeping a stable job, which may lead up to them becoming homeless. Though this isn't the case for everyone, some adult survivors will also engage in high-risk sexual behavior. These actions can lead to physical problems, such as acquiring a sexually transmitted disease or becoming pregnant. Survivors who are physically abused are more likely to display aggression and violent behavior. Even children who are exposed to their parents' domestic violence may display violent behaviors. For the most part, alcohol and substance abuse patterns are mostly done as a way to self-medicate, but can easily turn into a pattern of abuse very quickly. And finally, there is a large correlation between child abuse and eating disorders, especially obesity. Thankfully, after years of research, there are now different treatment programs and theories used to treat people who were abused as children. The one that I will be focusing on is called component-based psychotherapy, or CBP. The primary goal of CBP is to help victims treat their traumatic stress symptoms. This is done by using a four-component process. The four components for CBP are relationships, regulation, working with dissociative aspects of the self, and narrative. In the first component, relationship, the therapist works with the client to help encourage to build relationships with others and establish a safe environment. By building relationships, it helps clients not to feel like they're on their own. It allows clients to create a support system that will help them. In the second component, the therapist focuses on helping the client regulate negative thoughts and emotions that may occur. Some of the methods that were done to help alleviate negative emotions were through relaxation and breathing techniques. In the third component, the dissociation component, the therapist focuses on educating the client on their behaviors. This may be through allowing the client to explain why they react the way they do. This in turn will help the client notice when they're displaying good behavior or displaying negative behavior. This will help clients recognize certain triggers and be able to adopt healthier behaviors to cope with their abuse. Lastly, the final component of CBP, the therapist and client work together to build a narrative, or a story of the client's life. This component may make it more helpful for clients to share events of their past. It helps them reflect on their past and answer and ask questions about their abuse. Ultimately, I think the most important part about narrating the story of your own life is the fact that we are the writers of our own lives. Only we have the power to change our future for the better. Component-based therapy isn't the only therapy option that is offered to child abuse victims. Because everybody suffers differently, everybody also heals differently and needs help in different ways. It's important to not become discouraged if one therapy theory isn't working for you, because there are different options that may help instead, and it might take having to go to a few therapists to actually get the help you need. I found a very interesting identity development model in an article that classifies hypothetically how a victim may consider themselves throughout their journey of abuse. For example, a victim of abuse may classify themselves as no self. This could have a number of meanings to an individual. This could mean that they don't feel worthy, that they're treated so badly that they've become a nobody. The values tied to no self include emptiness and disconnection. The second stage is known as the damaged self. This may be them recognizing that they're damaged, that either their abuse is ruining them or they're brainwashed by their abuser to believe they are damaged and that no one will be capable of loving them. The values to stage 2 include shame and damage. The third stage is when an abuser classifies themselves as a victim. They are aware of the injustice that is being done to them. They are aware that they are a victim and they aren't at fault. The fourth stage is when a person classifies themselves as a survivor. This is usually when their abuse has stopped. They have survived their trauma. And the last stage is simply known as the person stage. I find this incredibly touching because this is a stage where an abuser has suffered from feeling like they were a nobody, that they were damaged, that they were victimized, and in the last stage, they can finally recognize themselves as a person who is deserving, a person who is worthy, a person who, yes, was a victim and a survivor, but a person who isn't just those things. They accept what was done, but they continue to strive just to be a person. Though not stated, I feel as though this identity development model can be very fluid, which means a person may go back from stage 3 to stage 2 to stage 1. A victim may finally classify themselves as a person, but then struggle with their recovery and bounce back to being a survivor. What's important is that they continue to strive to become a person. If you are a victim, what can you do? A quote I read in a child abuse article states that your past does not have to rule your future. So if you are a victim, know that you're the author of your story. You have the power to change your life if you're willing to fight back for it. Another thing I want all survivors to understand is that there's no reason to fight this war alone. There are mental health professionals available to listen, validate, and help you through the entire process. As stated earlier, if one treatment intervention doesn't work, keep trying until you find someone who is able to help you in a way that works for you. What else can you do? Establish a support system. Being surrounded by people who are there to support you is crucial in the healing process. Having a support system is a way of helping people feel that they're not alone. There are also many different support groups available on the internet. One online support group website is listed on this slide. It is known as HAVOCA, or Help for Adult Victims of Child Abuse. This website allows victims to connect with others so they're able to share their experiences, support one another, and offer helpful advice to heal. Lastly, do not be afraid to speak up. You have a voice, and it should be heard. It doesn't matter how long your abuse was. Your feelings and your experiences should be heard, and you should get the help you deserve. Now, as a bystander or a future health professional, what can we do to help more victims? First, be observant. Take notice of the little changes a person may be exhibiting. Notice if friends or family members seem to be struggling in their lives. If you suspect something, don't be afraid to ask uncomfortable questions. Even though they're uncomfortable, sometimes all a victim needs is to know that someone cares enough to ask. Some victims may feel too ashamed or too guilty to speak up about their abuse. Sometimes victims need a little push to help themselves. If you are ever talking to a victim, it is imperative that you listen and that you're supportive. It's okay if you don't have the right words to say. Just by validating the victim can make all the difference. And if you're feeling generous, donate to a child abuse organization. And lastly, don't stay quiet. Victims need help. Speaking up can be a matter of saving a life. So, what have we learned today? Well, we learned that adult survivors of child abuse do exist. In fact, there are millions of them in America. This means there are millions of them that may be struggling right now and need our help. And we shouldn't be afraid of talking about this topic and educating others. We've learned that adult survivors are at risk of various types of consequences, ranging from physical and mental health problems to homelessness and risky sexual behavior. The good thing is that there are efficient evidence-based treatments such as component-based psychotherapy that focuses on alleviating traumatic stress for victims. We've learned that we have a duty as survivors and as bystanders to get help or to give help. You are never alone. Thank you.